Hello, I am Miss Darcy, and I am here today to share a book with you. I wonder if you have had this experience in your life. This is Sammy Jane, or Samantha Jane. She just lost her daddy. Her daddy died. Samantha Jane is missing her smile. It's a story about coping with the loss of a parent. It is written by Julie Kaplow and Donna Pincus, and the pictures or the illustrations are by Beth Spiegel. Come along as we read this book, Samantha's Missing Smile. Samantha Jane's friends called her Sammy Jane. Samantha Jane had long brown hair, and she liked to twirl it around her finger when she got bored. Her face turned rosy in the summer sun, and her eyes sparkled whenever she smiled. But Sammy Jane hasn't been smiling much lately. Samantha Jane lost her smile about a month ago. That was when her dad died. She hasn't found much of the smile since then. Today, Sammy Jane is sitting outside on her front steps. It's a sunny day, and she's making shadow puppets with her fingers on the sidewalk. Sammy Jane is trying not to cry, but she misses her daddy very, very much. You can see that she's looking at pictures of her daddy. Oh, what great memories they had together. And there she's making some shadow puppets. Have you ever made shadow puppets before? It's really fun to play in the sun, make shadow puppets. Sammy Jane's next door neighbor walks out in the front door of her house. Her name was Mrs. Cooper, and she has known Sammy Jane since she was a little baby. "Sammy Jane," she calls out, "would you like to come over and pick some berries?" Sammy Jane and her dad used to pick berries every Sunday morning in Mrs. Cooper's garden. Sammy Jane looked at the ground and she shook her head no. Mrs. Cooper came over to sit by her. "Sammy Jane, ever since you were a little girl, you've loved picking berries in my garden. But I've noticed that you haven't come to the garden since your daddy died." Mrs. Cooper came to help her. She had some questions, but she's noticing that Sammy Jane is feeling sad and might not want to go to the garden because her daddy's not there. "It's too sad, Mrs. Cooper," said Sammy Jane. "The garden reminds me of my dad, and then I start to miss him. Oh, I feel like I'm going to cry." "You know," said Mrs. Cooper in a soft voice, "crying can make a very good way to wash some of the sad feelings so that there is room for happy feelings to get in." Sammy Jane said, "But sometimes I think that if I start crying, I just won't be able to stop. It really is easier to try to push those sad feelings away." Mrs. Cooper stood up. "Sammy Jane, can I show you something?" Sammy Jane nodded. Mrs. Cooper led her to the small pool in her garden. There they go. I wonder what Sammy Jane is going to find out from Mrs. Cooper. Mrs. Cooper picks up a twig from the ground. "Let's pretend that this twig is your sad feelings. Watch. Let's see what happens when I try to push the twig down into the water." Mrs. Cooper tried to push the twig down into the water. It popped right back up. She said. "I wonder if it will stay underwater if I try to push it down harder." Mrs. Cooper tried to push the twig down with all of her might, but it still popped up, and even faster this time. Mrs. Cooper said, "Our feelings can be just like this twig. The harder you try to push them down inside of you, the more they just rise to the top again." Mrs. Cooper put her arm around Sammy Jane's shoulders. "It's so hard to miss a person that you love. And it's hard not being able to do all the fun things that you used to do, isn't it? Mrs. Cooper has some great advice for Sammy. Sammy Jane started to feel tears stinging in her eyes. "It's just not fair," she said. "Why do other kids get to keep their dads and mine is gone? It's just not fair." Mrs. Cooper hugged Sammy Jane. "Sometimes things just happen to us and they don't make sense. You're right. It isn't fair that you can't play with your dad or hug him anymore." Sammy Jane cried and cried, and Mrs. Cooper hugged her until she couldn't shed another tear. Then she said, "You may not be able to see your dad or talk to him, but that doesn't mean that he's not part of your life anymore. He'll always be your dad, and he'll always be with you. It will be a different way, though." Sammy Jane looked at Mrs. Cooper. "What do you mean?" she said. "Well, let's take a look here. Look at the grass. Look at the sky. Look at everything around you. Can you find something that reminds you of the happy time that you had with your dad?" Sammy Jane looked at the ground, and then she looked up at the sky, and she saw a beautiful white seagull. "That bird reminds me of Dad when he was pushing me on the swing. I felt like I was flying, just like that bird is." Mrs. Cooper smiled. "That's lovely. What else do you see?" Sammy Jane pointed to the trees. "Do you see those weeping willows? Whenever we play hide and seek, Dad could never find me because of those long branches. And do you see this red rose? It looks like the same kind of rose that Dad always brought me and Mom on Valentine's Day. And look at that bumblebee. It reminds me of Halloween and when I wore a bug costume and Dad took me trick-or-treating. I shared all my candy with him." "You have so many beautiful memories, Sammy Jane." Sammy Jane was quiet for a minute. And then she said, "So it's kind of like my dad is everywhere I go." Mrs. Cooper smiled. "Yes, Sammy Jane, it certainly is." Sammy Jane's face lit up. Sammy Jane looked at the pond. "I think we may have found that smile of yours that was missing." A minute later, the smile was gone again. "Hey, what happened, Sammy Jane?" asked Mrs. Cooper. "Where did that smile go?" Sammy Jane was quiet. "Mrs. Cooper, can I tell you something? Sometimes I worry that if I'm smiling too much or if I'm having fun, people will think that I didn't love my dad. How can I be happy when my dad died?" Mrs. Cooper nodded her head. "Whenever you feel worried about that," she said, "I think about what your dad would have wanted. You knew him pretty well. Do you think that he would want you to be sad all the time?" Sammy Jane thought for a moment. "No way. He liked when I was happy." "I have an idea." Mrs. Cooper reached into her pocket and she pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. "Let's pretend you can send your dad a letter. What would you want to tell him?" Sammy Jane took the notebook and the pencil, and she wrote until her hand hurt. And then she wrote a little bit more. "Do you want to hear what I wrote?" she asked when she finished. "If you'd like to share with me, I'd love to hear it." Sammy Jane read, "Dear Dad, I'm having a good time in 3rd grade, but I miss you very, very much. I've been sad a lot. Remember how you used to call me Smiling Sammy? I wish that I could smile and be happy again. Mrs. Cooper said it's okay to be sad sometimes, but that you would want me to be happy sometimes too. I think she might be right. Maybe I should start doing all the fun things that I used to do, like playing with my friends and telling jokes, dancing, and laughing. I'm going to tell Mom that she doesn't have to be sad all the time either. Maybe Mom can even pick berries with me just like you used to do. That might cheer her up a little bit. I know that we will be okay. I love you, Dad. When I miss you, I know that I can look around and remember the fun things that we did together. And it's kind of like you are there with me all the time. Love, your smiling Sammy. Oh, what a beautiful letter that is, Sammy Jane, said Mrs. Cooper. Maybe your mom would like to read it too. I thought I heard some voices out here, said Sammy Jane's mom. What have you been doing? I wrote Dad a letter, Sammy Jane said. Do you want to read it? Sammy Jane sees tears in her mom's eyes as she reads the letter. Her mom gave Sammy Jane a big hug as soon as she was done. I really like this letter, Sammy Jane. You know what? Sometimes even moms need to be reminded that it's okay to laugh and be happy after someone dies. I'm so glad that you could talk to Mrs. Cooper, but I do want you to know, when you're feeling sad or confused or upset, that's what moms are for. Sammy Jane said, but sometimes I worry that if I talk to you about Dad, then you're going to feel sad. And I don't want you to feel sad. Sammy Jane's mom put her arms around Sammy. Sometimes it does make me sad to think about your dad because I miss him just like you do. And sometimes I cry, but I always feel better after I do. We might even want to be sad or cry together sometimes. There is nothing for you to worry about. Both of us are going to be okay, just like you said in the letter. Sammy Jane smiles, and she hugged her mom very tight. Do you have an extra basket, Mrs. Cooper? Asked Sammy Jane's mom. I think we have some berry picking to do. Mrs. Cooper's eyes twinkled as she handed them a basket. Together, Sammy Jane and her mom circled the garden, and she filled the basket with plump, juicy berries. When they reached Mrs. Cooper's pool, Sammy Jane looked down, and she saw her reflection in the water, and she sees a girl with long brown hair, sparkling eyes, and a big, bright smile. Boys and girls, I hope that even if you lost a mom or a dad, that you can find some joy. Make sure that you talk to a parent or that you talk to another loved one, maybe a grandparent, an aunt, uncle, or a nice neighbor, or maybe your teacher. We want to be there for you. Know that we're thinking about you and you're not alone during this time. Have a great day, and we'll talk again soon.